Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're taking a look at classical China, 3 major dynasties and how they would shape the rest of the region. So let's get started. The Zhou dynasty is the first one we're going to take a look at, and if you look at those years, you're going to notice immediately, wow, that was a long time that they ruled. I mean, the better part of 1,000 years. But that's also foundation age. The thing about the Zhou dynasty is they came to power, stayed in power, probably a lot longer than they should have, and probably actually collapsed a lot longer than 256, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The Zhou dynasty before the Zhou dynasty was the Shang dynasty. And the Shang dynasty's last few kings were really, really bad. The Zhou forces would ultimately topple and then created this political concept to justify the collapse of one dynasty for another, the mandate of heaven. This is a political argument that was made by the founders of the Zhou dynasty when they realized very quickly that, oh wow, we actually toppled a dynasty and we have to do some quasi-ethical things to make sure that that dynasty never ever comes back. And some of those things, like I said, quasi-ethical, included killing all members of the Shang family line, were not really popular among the people. To justify this, the Zhou said this idea of the mandate of heaven. If that last dynasty was so good, then the forces of heaven would have stepped in to save them, to do anything at all. But since those forces of heaven did not step in to save the Shang dynasty, they deserved to be destroyed and removed. And the people of China got behind this idea. And we're going to see a cultural element of the mandate of heaven in calling the ruler, the king until it's an emperor, the son of heaven. Every single time that we see China go through a dynastic change, this tool is always used to justify that transitional change. The Zhou had started a process of decentralizing the government relatively early on, and this graphic represented here kind of shows what that looked like. Instead of having one chief king ruling directly over everyone, you had one chief king who disseminated power to local princes and then relatives and then governors to rule directly. Now, the upside of this is that the local regional rulership could get involved and fix a local problem really easy because they're real close to the problem. The downside to this is that over time, the function of the ruler, the function of the monarch, becomes less and less. And this will ultimately lead to the rise of feudalism in China. If you're a feudal lord, it's not bad. If you want to grow in the rank, it's usually not good. And because of the nature of this, we're going to see feudal lords going back and forth, warring with each other over anything as petty as, hey, I want your land, to, hey, I perceived you insulted me, so we're going to go to war. And this centralized state really helped facilitate the end of the Zhou dynasty eventually. Culturally speaking, we see the veneration of ancestors continued from the Shang. The idea that your ancestors who had passed on would get involved in your life, would get influential in what you did, and that things would eventually get better if you took care of your ancestors. And if you did not take care of those ancestors, if you didn't pay attention to the shrines or give homage to them on like their birthdays or certain other days, then you could expect them to get mad and then bad stuff intangibly happen to you. Socially, the ladder in China is made up of about the same things. At the top, you've got your ruling elites, followed by your specialized laborers. These are going to be blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, that kind of thing. Then you've got the peasant class. It's weird because in China they call these people the mean people, despite the fact that this is made up of the plurality of the population. They're called mean people with the idea that you didn't do anything with your life. You didn't make anything of yourself. You're just an average person. And that was not a good thing. Then you've got your slaves, and then beneath the slaves, in many cases, is the merchants. And, that's really different than what we see in the rest of all civilizations, is where the merchant class is listed. They're listed here in China because the Chinese at the time thought anyone could sell anything. It took no skill to do it. In fact, usually you had to swindle somebody to get them to buy something they didn't need, or buy something that was of inferior quality at a highly inflated price. And because of this, the average Chinese person viewed the merchant class as an underclass, despite the fact that members of this class usually were very, very wealthy, and over time, very powerful. And then there's the role of women, which is kind of outside this social ladder and a part of it at the same time. In China, the role of women is pretty bad, and it stays pretty bad almost exclusively. During the Zhou Dynasty, we see some interesting bits of literature and books and thought and stuff come out. The Book of Change was a manual for individuals who are trying to divine the future, like interpret signs from your ancestors or signs from nature and figure out the past. The Book of History is exactly that. Well, the Book of Rites was, how to act in public, etiquette, rituals. This was definitely for your upper class individuals, your ruling caste, your aristocrats, that kind of thing. The Art of War was this collection of work by philosopher Sun Tzu on warfare, and it says things like attack from a higher position, attack with more men, use your enemy's weaknesses to your advantage, all this kind of stuff. And then there's the Book of Songs, which really is the most notable of all these classical works. It was a series of works and books and concepts that were anywhere from joking to serious, and by songs it means both poetry and, actual song. So it really did affect the culture of the day-to-day life of these people. Unfortunately, most of this has been destroyed because of the work of Shi Huangdi, which I'll get to in just a few minutes. The biggie in Zhou Dynasty's classical age philosopher was Confucius, Master Cheng. Master Cheng came from a good family, aristocratic born. He spent the better part of a decade trying to find a job for himself, was very, very smart. He taught many different disciplines, and a variety of his sayings were ultimately compiled in a book called the Analects, and that was put together by his students. The fundamental ideas of Confucianism is that life is crazy, life is chaotic, and you need structure and order to make things better. Without structure and order, all of society falls apart. He talks about the fundamental nature of relationships, father to son, ruler to ruled, that kind of stuff, and the importance of following these in order to create a better society. Daoism, sometimes this is written with a T, sometimes it's written with a D. Technically, both are correct. Was a critic of Confucianism. Lao Tzu, and Zhongzhang said that, life is crazy, just like Confucius says. But while Confucius says that you need order to fix the craziness of life, Taoists say, go with it. There is crazy in life, and you can't fight it. The symbol of the Taoist is here on the screen, the yin-yang. It's all about balance. Light, dark, darkness and light, lightness and dark. With every action, there is the opposite action also present. And this will create flow. Taoists believe that when you see chaos in the world, don't fight it. You can't fight it. It's impossible to fight it. Just go with it. Pick yourself up on the other side of it and keep moving on. The philosophy to address is legalism. And this was put together by a guy named Shang Yang and Han Fetzi. And the argument of the legalist is that all people are all bad all the time. all people are evil, and they need really strict rules, really strong leadership in order to have a good political system. And these two guys were not especially accepted. For example, Shangyang was executed by his political enemies when he tried to establish the idea that the ruler should rule with a very heavy hand. Most principally, that heavy hand meant that the punishment for almost any crime was death, and that if a ruler was not ruling well, then he himself should be put to death himself. Han Fetzi was also forced to suicide by his political enemies by synthesizing and architecting a lot of this stuff as well. The collapse of the Zhou dynasty was facilitated by the decentralization of the state. When people no longer felt they needed a major single entity anymore, they stopped listening to it. And territorial powers became more and more independent until ultimately the Zhou would collapse, and the different states in China would war with each other over supremacy. This lasts from 403 to 221 B.C.E. And on this map here on the bottom right, you can see the various different groups that were fighting, and how the Zhou were that tiny little chunk in the northern part of China. They were not a power anymore. The only reason they couldn't fall back any farther was because the Great Wall was there. The Warring States period ended in 221 BCE with one of the states, the Qin state, growing to power and uniting the people and basically creating a new China. In fact, this province would become so great, so strong, so successful that China itself gets its name from the Qin Dynasty. The man who started it all, the man who was responsible for the unification, was Shi Huangdi, made king, Qin Shi Huangdi, and then emperor in 221. He is going to be the one who established the idea of a central imperial rule. No longer decentralized like the Zhou did, no longer king like the Shang did, emperor over all of China. When he came to power, he took the children of the various different nobles from the different states and held them as hostages in his capital. And he did this with the idea that if you play nice, your kids will survive to adulthood and they'll be treated good, they'll live a good life. But if you rise up, these are the first that will fall in any kind of rebellion. He takes power and he holds power. He makes these giant building projects, the most notable of which was the Great Wall. Now, the Great Wall had existed before this point, but he connected and extended it in a way that's going to, well, it makes, when I say Great Wall, what you're thinking, yeah, that happened because of Shi Huang. But these things he did are not always good. He really would suppress any form of resistance. It didn't matter if you were a noble or an average person. If you were found even just studying the wrong thing, you could be dead for it. If you were found practicing Confucianism or even reading a Confucian text, you were killed, in some cases extremely brutally, to show an example of this. When he finally died, he ordered, and he died trying to find, immortality like so many people do, but, he was not able to, and he ordered that upon his death, a tomb be made for him, a very specific tomb with, well, let's take a look. This. Terracotta soldiers. Terracotta is a type of clay. Soldiers. Horses. Entertainers. It's an entire army that was created. There's thousands of these that were created. And it was all thought to be, a joke, a rumor, because while evidence that an army like this had been made, no one had ever found it. Not until 1974, when a farmer was just tilling his field and finds a terracotta head, and he does some digging, literally, and voila, he finds a whole body, and then a body next to that, and you can see how big this is. And this was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Without Shi Huangdi, power passed to his son, and the people followed Shi Huangdi not because he was the best, but because they were terrified of the man. And his son was not that force of blinding terror. So without Shi Huangdi around, the people rose up, overthrew Shi Huangdi's son, and the Qin dynasty fell. And we'd see the establishment of a new dynasty, the Han. This is our last one. The Han dynasty is usually referenced as the Golden Age in China, the Golden Age of Chinese culture and history, and it really was significant for the kind of transformations we see in China at this time. Gaozu, or Liu Bang, became the first emperor in 202. 7 years after he becomes emperor, he dies, and then there was a massive civil war that followed. It lasted about 15 years when his wife's family tried to seize control. It did not work out too good for her. Maybe the best international thing that was created during the Han Dynasty was the Silk Road. Well, actually, Silk Roads, plural. There was a bunch of them. But these were the connecting routes that went from China all the way to Italy. And on this map, it shows some of the stuff that was traded along the way, and some of the places that were popular to go. And this is really a light list when you look at it, because it doesn't talk about any of the philosophies, any of the religions that were also working their way back and forth, but this connected people. It connected things. It was the thing that's going to affect social, political, culture, economics, interactions, all across the world for China and everywhere connected to it. In about the 2nd century Common Era, the Chinese create paper, and this was a lot like paper that we have today. It wasn't nearly as good as the paper we have today, but it was way better than anything that had been before. Prior to this, paper was very light, very difficult to write on, and it usually had a shelf life of only a few years. The paper that the Chinese are able to start producing in this time is the stuff that's still around now. And they're also going to produce a printing press, and this happens after the Han Dynasty, but it was definitely a creation and byproduct of having decent paper. More paper is available, so you can pass on knowledge better, you can pass on things better. During the Han Dynasty, legalism is going to go the way of, Shi Huangdi, and it's going to be replaced with Confucianism, and most infamously, the Confucian Civil Service exam. This was a test that any man could take, and that does mean any boy could take it. And it was a long test. In some cases, you could spend days taking just the first stage of the test. But it was open to anybody. It didn't matter if you were the son of an aristocrat or the son of a farmer. You could still take the test. And if you passed the test, you could get a good government job. Just like that. The Chinese loved this idea because no longer was aristocracy and nobility the ones who could be in charge. Anybody could be. Admittedly, it was a lot easier for the son of an aristocrat or bureaucrat to study for the test, but it didn't mean that you couldn't study or pass. Anyone could. The big thing that the Chinese are going to produce and have a massive monopoly on is going to be silk. They had a total monopoly on this throughout this time period and even farther than this. And the role of silk in China is going to make China more than any other product they could have. This mythical faraway thing. This imaginary material that could change and transform anything. And everybody liked it and everybody wanted it. And since the Chinese were the only ones who knew the secrets of silk and how to make silk, they could do with it as they saw fit. And usually that meant keep those secrets or, at least trade them for a lot of money. was a massive peasant rebellion that we see take place in China during about a 12-year gap called the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And this was peasants who were just tired of being at the bottom, peasants who wanted to see a change, peasants who believed that the system was rigged against them in every way they could. And they, well, tried to take over. It did not work well for them, but it did signify that the people were willing to stand up. And any time we see this, people willing to stand up is usually for a reason. In China, the color yellow is really significant because it's the color of the hero. So these guys are dressing themselves in the archetype of a hero. It'd be like if I was wearing a Superman shirt. That same kind of concept. The major troubles that the Han get into pretty quickly and then stay there. Most notably is they start taking too much control. They start raising a lot of tax money, they start taking a lot of land, they start centralizing more and more power in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And anytime this happens, we call this bad news. There's continued social tensions, especially after the Yellow Turban Rebellion, that the problems of the Yellow Turban Rebellion were never actually fixed. So the people were never really pacified or happy that what had happened had happened. And over time, more and more power, more and more land is held in the hands of fewer and fewer individuals. This was ultimately came to a head when Emperor Liu Zhou abdicated. In 220, he just walked away from the throne. He said, enough of this, no more of this, I'm out. And there was no clear who's next in line. And with Liu Zhou gone and this situation, a series of different warlords and then generals and then just popular, I use the word cult but not in that manner, just popular individuals with a cult of personality about them came to power, each trying to control China, no one able to. And China is going to fall into turmoil for about the next 3.5 centuries. This is kind of like the Warring States period, only it lasted much longer. You can put it in the same Rome fell then what problem that we saw in Western Europe, but again, not nearly as bad. But with the fall of the Han, we say that China's golden age kind of fell with them. And that really is all I have to share with you today about classical China. Hope you enjoyed yourself. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.